Welcome to meeting number 57 of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of June 23, 2022. Members are attending in person in the room as well as remotely using Zoom. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of the members and the witnesses. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please do mute yourselves when you are not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom is at the bottom of your screens, and you have a choice of either Floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. In accordance with our routine motion, I am informing the committee that all witnesses have completed the required and initial connection tests in advance of our meeting. Now, pursuant to the order of reference of Wednesday, November 16th, 2022, the committee resumes consideration of Bill C-281, an act to amend the Department of Foreign Affairs Trade and Development Act, the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act, the Broadcasting Act, and the Prohibiting Cluster Munitions Act. Now, because we did have a vote, we've moved the panels around a bit. So for the first panel, we will hear from witnesses until 12:30, and then our second panel will go from 12:30 to 1:15. Now, before introducing our panelists, I should point out that we were just advised by Professor Terp that he will be leaving us at 12:15. So to the extent that you do have questions of him, please try to make sure that it happens as soon as possible. Now, it's my great pleasure to welcome to the committee, as an individual, Professor Daniel Terp, with the Faculty of Law, University of Montreal. Also from the Canada-Tibet Committee, we have Sharap Turchin, who is the Executive Director and is here in person. And last, but certainly not least, we're also hearing from Hong Kong Watch, and we have the pleasure of having with us Ms. Catherine Leung, who is the Policy Advisor. Now, each of you will be provided 5 minutes for your opening remarks, after which we will allow the members to ask you questions. When you're getting very close to the 5-minute mark, or when members are questioning you and time is out, I will put this up. I'd appreciate it if each one of the witnesses try to wrap up their comments as soon as possible. Now, given the schedule of our witnesses, we will start off with Professor Terp. Professor Terp, you have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Thank you. Honourable members of Parliament, Madam Clerk, I would like to begin by greeting the members of the committee and by saying what a pleasure it is to be back in the House of Commons, where I had the privilege of sitting as the MP for Beauharnois-Salaberry during his 36th Parliament from 1997 to 2000. I am responding to the invitation to appear sent to me by your clerk to present my remarks on the Bill 281, Bill C-281. Unfortunately, I will have to leave quickly because I have a prior commitment that I need to honor as a former MP that wants to keep his word. In the short time allotted to me, I will comment on one clause of Bill C-281, the one that proposes to amend the Department of Foreign Affairs Trade and Development Act, and I would like to indicate that I am in agreement with the 3 clauses of the bill that propose to amend 3 other acts mentioned in Bill C-281. Section 2 of the bill interests me. It is the one that seeks to amend Section 10 of the Department of Foreign Affairs Trade and Development Act by adding a paragraph 4. And this says that the minister shall in connection with the conduct of the External Affairs of Canada, published at least once in each calendar year a report that summarizes the steps it has taken to advance human rights internationally as part of Canada's foreign policy, and B, a list of the names and status of prisoners of conscience who are detained throughout the world and who are being actively pursued by the Government of Canada. So I fully agree with the proposal to require the Minister of Foreign Affairs to publish a report on the progress of human rights around the world. Canada would not be the first. The U.S. has been publishing this type of report for approximately 50 years. The last report was published a few days ago on March 20th, a report according to country, and there are comments on Canada in this report and the situation of fundamental rights in Canada. These are also published by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, as well as several NGOs such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. Such a report would provide an additional source of information on the state of human rights within the international community of states as a whole, and would contribute to a better understanding of the human rights situation in the world. Now, with respect to the list of prisoners of conscience that might be published, I believe that the concept of prisoners of conscience should be defined in the new draft. A possible source of inspiration could be the definition used by Amnesty International, where they say it is any person who is detained or restricted in his or her liberty on account of his or her political or religious beliefs or any other reason of conscience, ethnic origin, gender, or sexual orientation, color, language, social origin or nationality, economic status, birth, or other status, and who has not used violence. So with respect to the list itself, here's my second comment. I share the views expressed during the review of the bill, and in particular those expressed by MP Christine Normandin, that exceptions should be allowed and names omitted from the list and mechanisms developed because of the possible breach of security of prisoners that could result from such publication. Mr. Chair, parliamentarians, here are a few observations. I hope this will be useful, and I hope you have fruitful deliberations. I regret that I'm not able to stay. I hope that this bill will be passed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Turp. We next go to...
Point of information, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Zuberi.
I'm flabbergasted that we are starting the meeting when we just had voted. This is unprecedented. We just finished a vote in the House of Commons here, and we started a committee meeting moments after. We don't even have time to walk to the committee room. How did this happen?
We did have a quorum, and it was the will of the committee members who were here to get started, given the time restraints.
But this has never happened before. This has never happened before.
Point well taken.
How did... I'd like to... I mean, I'm going to channel in my inner Garnet. I just hope that this will never happen again. I hope the vice chair is there, Mr. Janis.
What is he at?
I'm going to channel my inner Garnet, and I'm just asking that this doesn't happen again.
Point well taken. Thank you, Mr. Zuberi. Now we will proceed with our second witness, Mr. Tarachin. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, honorable members of the committee, for inviting me to testify before this esteemed committee. I would like to use this opportunity to speak on the arbitrary detention, torture, and killings in Tibet. And I would like to start by sharing the stories of some Tibetans who were detained, tortured, killed in recent years. In July 2022, a 56-year-old Tibetan monk, Jigme Gyatso, died after prolonged illness, multiple organ failure caused by the torture and the inhuman treatment he endured in the prison. He was detained several times over the period of 15 years. The first time he was detained was in 2006 when he returned to Tibet after attending the teachings of His Holiness the Dalai Lama in India. He was detained for the second time in 2008, around the time when there was protests in Tibet during the 2008 Beijing Olympic. When he was detained for the second time, he was waiting nearby his monastery to repair his shoes. Although he had not taken part in the 2008 Beijing Olympic protest, he was still detained based on his past history of being detained. After his release, Jigme created a video testimony providing a first-hand account of the torture he endured. In the video, Jigme reveals what he had told the Chinese police forces before his release. Quote, "If you kill me, then that will be the end of it. But if I'm able to leave and get the opportunity, I will speak about the torture I endured. I will bear witness as a truthful voice to the suffering of my friends and report these events to the media," unquote. Likewise, in February 2021, a Tibetan tour guide named Kunchok Jimpa died in a hospital 3 months after being transferred from prison without the knowledge of his family. He was serving a 21-year-old prison sentence for sharing information to the outside world, to the foreign media, about a local environmental protest. The local sources said that he had brain hemorrhage and body paralysis. In the same year, a 19-year-old Tibetan monk, Tenzin Nyima, died after being released from prison in a comatose state. Tenzin was arrested along with 4 other monks for their peaceful demonstration nearby the local police authorities demanding the Tibetan independence. He was released in 2020, but was rearrested the same year for allegedly sharing the news of his arrest to Tibetans in exile. In 2020, a 36-year-old mother, Lamo, died shortly after being transferred to hospital from police custody. She was detained on the charges of sending money to her family in exile in India. Her body was immediately cremated, preventing any further investigation on her case. Mr. Chair, there are many other Tibetan prisoners who died in prison or shortly after being released or transferred from prison. They were not terrorists, they were not separatists, nor dangerous to the state security as China accused them to be. They were mothers, they were entrepreneurs, they were tour guides, they were monks, they were singers who had dreams about living a dignified life as Tibetan in their own lands. Mr. Chair, what binds this story together is how they didn't have access to lawyers, how they didn't have access to their family while being detained, and how none of them had an opportunity for a fair trial, how they were tortured and discriminated just because they were Tibetans, and how none of their cases so far have been investigated, and none of their perpetrators are being held accountable. As indicated in Jigme Gyatso, the 56-year-old monk video testimony, they expected those of us in exile, those of us living in a free democratic countries like Canada, to raise the challenges, to talk about issues that they faced. They risked their lives in passing information to the outside world so that we would know about the reality of situation in Tibet, so that we would know about over 1 million Tibetan nomads being forcibly relocated, so that we would know about over 1 million Tibetan children forced into boarding school for political indoctrination, so that we would know about the destructions of Tibetan monasteries such as Larungar and Yarchengar, and so that we would know about the evictions of Tibetan monks and nuns, and so that those of us in exile, those of us in a free world would know about the cultural genocide that is taking place in Tibet through the destructions of their language, religion, and cultural identity. Mr. Chair, the situation in Tibet under President Xi Jinping is dire and urgent. I request this committee to consider using tools we have at our disposal, such as Sergei Magnitsky Act and this bill to C-281, to challenge and counter such blatant human rights violation. We cannot and must not let the perpetrators to continue any more of such crimes with impunity. Thank you.
Certainly a difficult testimony, but we're very, very grateful for that. Now for our final witness, we will go to Ms. Leung. Ms. Leung, you have 5 minutes as well. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Catherine Leung, and I'm the Policy Advisor for Hong Kong Watch in Canada. Hong Kong Watch supports the heart of Bill C-281, which would make it easier for parliamentarians to recommend foreign officials who should be included on a sanctions list, including those guilty for the ongoing human rights crackdown in Hong Kong. As committee members will no doubt be aware, many of these Hong Kong officials have links to Canada, including owning property, having family members with foreign passports, and having been educated here. The bill would also rightly increase the government's powers to ban state propaganda outfits operating in Canada, like CGTN, who spread disinformation and seek to interfere in our public debate. Such a ban would bring Canada in line with like-minded partners like the UK, which banned CGTN in February 2021. The specific amendment to the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development Act is a welcome provision. As I'm sure members are aware, Hong Kong has over 1,000 political prisoners at this time, and this number is only growing. We note that there are several political prisoners who previously held Canadian citizenship or who have family links to Canada. The Hong Kong authorities have jailed so many political prisoners in the last several years that overcrowding in prisons is a growing problem, as the authorities are running out of space to put the activists, journalists, and trade unionists that they have incarcerated. Hong Kong has one of the largest growing populations of political prisoners in the world. With over 10,000 politically related arrests since 2019, we urge global affairs to consider better tools to track and identify those prisoners of conscience who have links to Canada. We believe this new provision will allow NGOs like Hong Kong Watch to be better equipped to advocate for the release of people whose only crime is to fight for the betterment of their country. Regarding the provision on the Magnitsky Act, we should be proud to be one of the first countries in the world to adopt a Magnitsky sanctions regime, which allows us to target and hold to account individual human rights violators. It is therefore sad to note that not a single entity or individual from China has currently been sanctioned by Canada under the Magnitsky Act. As members will be aware, Canada has sanctioned just 4 individuals and 1 entity in China for human rights violations in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region under the Special Economic Measures Act. We have no shortage of reasons to sanction Chinese and Hong Kong officials. In fact, parliamentarians have repeatedly called on the government to do so in the form of letters and committee reports. Sanctions are a tool for Canada to hold human rights violators accountable. Tools only work when they're used. From what we have seen, there's an inconsistency in the government's approach. It has introduced a Magnitsky sanctions regime, which it claims is world-leading, yet it refuses to use it, instead relying on CIMA. The sole purpose of the Magnitsky Act is to protect human rights on a global scale, whereas CIMA exists as an economic sanction scheme and is not intended to be used solely against human rights violations. The proposal of this bill to create a mechanism by which the Minister of Foreign Affairs is required to respond to recommendations made by a parliamentary committee is a welcome step forward. This will serve as a way to not only incentivize the government to utilize this tool for its intended purpose, but will also provide transparency on the reasons behind such decisions. After all, sanctions do not sit in a vacuum from wider policymaking. They are political in nature and have a significant impact on the bilateral relations between countries. The decision and reasoning not to sanction an individual human rights violator is as important as the rationale for doing so. This provision of the bill will help inform the public, civil society groups, and NGOs on the wider thinking when it comes to the government's sanction policy and its commitments to uphold human rights. Turning to the amendment to the Broadcasting Act, I believe Canadians would find it reasonable that regimes that are committing genocide or ongoing human rights violations should not be given a platform on Canadian airwaves. The distribution of state propaganda from countries that grossly violate human rights is not in the public interest. For example, CGTN is under the control of the Central Propaganda Department of the Chinese Communist Party. It is a tool of propaganda, disinformation, and the violation of human rights. In 2019, CGTN aired a forced confession video of Hong Kong activist Simon Cheng recorded under duress, which he was coerced into filming as a condition for his release. CGTN has also broadcasted blatant disinformation, such as the denial of the Uyghur genocide, mischaracterizing the Hong Kong pro-democracy movements as riots rather than peaceful protests, and claiming that COVID-19 originated in the US in contradiction to scientific evidence. An important point to raise is who is on the receiving end of this propaganda. In Canada, it is largely Chinese immigrants communities that are consuming this. To allow CGTN to continue operating on public state-owned Canadian airwaves is to allow Beijing's propaganda to misinform, propagandize, and have direct influence on Chinese-speaking Canadians. In closing, we are supportive of Bill C-281 as a way to increase government accountability and transparency in Canada's role in upholding human rights internationally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lung.
Point of personal privilege.
Yes, Mr. Zuberi.
So I'd just like to note for the record, if I did not have my computer today and my phone, I would not have been able to participate in this committee meeting. The only reason why I'm able to participate in this meeting right now is because I have my laptop. My phone is actually in the shop and I cannot vote remotely. So it would have been physically impossible for me if somebody did not message me on my personal cell to tell me that this committee had started for me to participate as a member of this committee to be in this meeting. This meeting should not have started within 10 minutes after we had completed the vote count.
Mr. Zuberi, again, as I indicated earlier.
And the Conservatives have filibustered for 7 meetings. This will be heard.
Mr. Zuberi, again.
I implore that this does not happen ever again. It would not be physically
Mr.
possible.
Zuberi, your point is well taken. As was indicated, this has happened previously as well when we have a tight schedule. If there is a quorum, the members can say, can we resume?
The Conservative Party has not respected this committee. It has filibustered this committee for 7 meetings. And our witnesses in this committee have been sidelined, have been disrespected by the Conservative Party. And this is a matter of parliamentary privilege, the way how this organization functions. We cannot even have witnesses if this organization doesn't function properly.
Thank you, Mr. Zuberi. Now we will proceed with questions to
Chair. Just on the question of privilege,
Mr.
if I can comment on it. I'm not sure what this has to do with the Conservative Party. The member has raised a question of privilege, and it's the prerogative of the chair to rule on it.
This has everything to do with you personally and the Conservative Party. You have filibustered this committee for 7 meetings in the past. This has everything to do with you personally.
You're raising a question. The member raised a question of privilege, and the chair can rule on that question of privilege, or he can reserve judgment for later. But I'm not the chair. Just to be clear, I'm not the chair.
But you have filibustered this meeting for 7 meetings in the past. It's been documented and reported upon.
That's not what we're talking about today.
That's a fact.
It's not the question of privilege you raised. Anyways, I'm done. Thank you.
The issue of privilege is that this committee should not have happened in any way whatsoever. From the point that I personally could physically walk from the House of Commons, vote, and get to this committee meeting. This meeting should not have happened.
Thank you.
Not have started, I should
Now, given
say.
the limited time we have available for questions from the witnesses, we will proceed with questions. I should advise all the members that regrettably Mr. Terp had to leave us due to a previous engagement, so he's no longer connected. So we can now proceed with questions for the 2 witnesses that remain, which is Mr. Turchin from the Canada-Tibet Committee and Ms. Catherine Lung from the Hong Kong Watch. So the first question goes to MP Lawrence. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you very much. Just for the chair, I'll be splitting my time with Mr. Jennis. I'll be just asking a couple of questions of you, Mr. Turchin, and thank you very much for your testimony. It was very moving and powerful, and I can certainly say for myself, and I'm sure there are many other rooms that we stand with Tibet. Just with respect to the first 2 parts of the C-281. The first one, the first area is prisoners of conscience. So just in general, maybe not getting into the specifics of the legislation, but do you believe that by shining more lights of some of the atrocities that are being happening against and prisoners of conscience being held by the regime in Beijing, do you believe that could be helpful to prisoners of conscience who are human rights defenders from Tibet?
Thank you for the question. Certainly, the reason I chose to talk about this particular topic of arbitrary detention, torture, and killing is because I find that this particular topic connects many other human rights violations. And Tibet issue is very complex and very multi-layered. We have lack of religious freedom. There are protests related to lack of opportunity to practice and promote Tibetan language. There are Tibetan nomads being, displaced. There are Tibetan children being forced into boarding schools. But what connects all of this is any Tibetans found protesting, raising their voice against any of these human rights violations are put immediately, without any formal charges, into the prison. And the trouble, the trauma, the torture that they go through have created an environment of fear among Tibetans in Tibet that deter many other Tibetans to participate in similar protests in future. And a good example is in 2008 Beijing Olympic, we saw protests across Tibet. And the purge on those who participated in 2008 Beijing Olympic continues till today. And hence, it's not surprised that we didn't see much protest in the last year Winter Olympic that happened in Beijing.
Thank you very much. I'll rest my time over to Mr. Jennis.
Thank you to our excellent witnesses today. And apologies for the time, the things beyond our control. Ms. Liang, you alluded to the fact that foreign state-controlled media is a form of foreign interference. I wonder if you can develop that idea a little bit and explain your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Mr. Jennis. It has been spoken about explicitly by Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang that overseas Chinese is a tool that they wish to use in exerting Chinese influence abroad. The way that this becomes interference instead of simple influence is that these overseas Chinese populations are fed misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda directly through CGTN on Canadian airwaves. I should note that it is primarily Chinese diaspora populations that are consuming this information, and therefore they are the tools that are used by the United Front Work Department to spread, if they take it as truth, to spread the disinformation to people who don't watch CGTN. It is also important to note that it has been stated in the United Front Work Department's mandates that they explicitly will guide the Chinese populations abroad. That is one of their objectives.
Thank you. We next go to MP Zuberi. MP Zuberi, you have 4 minutes. We can't hear you, Mr. Zuberi.
I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here and share that I have a lot of empathy and awareness of your causes, for your causes, and I thank you for being here in person and remotely today to testify. I'd also like to note that the subcommittee of this committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, is looking at a study relating to residential schools in Tibet. And I just ask you to look out for that in terms of the testimony that we're having there and what the committee will do from that study. I'd like to learn more about the situation in Tibet and to hear about what the views are with respect to how Tibetans are treated, and is it the case that in all situations that those who are receiving repression from the state, that their cases should always be put in public, or sometimes do we need to advocate in private for them? That's directed towards
Yes.
Mr. Terchin. Yes. Tetrin, sorry. Go ahead, please.
Thank you for the question. It would always help to make the challenges faced by Tibetans public, because one of the challenges we deal concerning Tibet is the lack of information coming out of Tibet. Tibet remains one of the most inaccessible regions in the entire world. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, Tibetans risk their life sharing their information, passing their information to their families in exile so that it would reach out to the outside world, so that we could talk about it in platforms like this. So it would certainly help to talk about the issues publicly. And I also wanted to add that the Dharamsala-based think tank, Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Development, they have a database of over 2,000 Tibetans being detained in Tibet. And many of them serve prison sentence from 10 to 15 years for charges as frivolous, I find, as passing information or talking to your family members in exile or sending money in case of 36-year-old mother to your family members who's in exile. There's nothing political about their activities, and yet they are detained, tortured, and in some cases killed in prison or after the release from the prison.
So pick up on that point around getting information out of Tibet. Can you, and outside of this legislation, can you talk about other items that you think might be helpful in order to get more information out from Tibet that relates to specific legislation or otherwise?
Absolutely. I think in addition to visits to Tibet, that happened in I believe in 2020 with the Ambassador Dominic Burton. I hope something like reciprocal access to Tibet, an act that was passed in the U.S. About 2 years ago, could really help here in Canada. The principle of reciprocity could be applied. We had Chinese appointed delegates from the so-called Tibetan Autonomous Region testifying before this very committee in 2018. And yet, we don't get the same opportunity for our parliamentarians, Canadian parliamentarians, to go independently without any restriction in any parts of the world. So unrestricted, independent visits by Canadian government officials, Canadian parliamentarians, Canadian media to Tibet would certainly help to gather more information about what's happening there.
Thank you, Mr. Starchin.
Thank you.
Thank you. We now go to Ms. Normandin. You have 4 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, and thank you to the two witnesses. For you, Mrs. Long, we've heard comments saying that if the recommendations on the Magnitsky Act recourse goes through a recommendation made by the committee to the minister, it is a risk that we might send out our intention to people who might withdraw their assets from the country, and there's a risk in imposing sanctions. I'd like to hear you speak to this, and perhaps a comment on is this risk balanced out by the possibility of having more recourse to Magnitsky if it comes from the committee?
Thank you for the question. I believe that there's always the risk of foreign officials wanting to move their assets. But what we do know right now is that foreign officials from China and from Hong Kong do store their assets overseas because of the likelihood that Xi Jinping will do another corruption crackdown. So there are many officials in Hong Kong in particular who have foreign assets, and they're usually under the name of a family member so that they wouldn't be traced when there is a corruption crackdown. It is for historical reasons that they do this because of Hong Kong's previous colonial history. But with that said, it is important that we do publish the list of names for individuals that we should sanction in Canada, because it is the leverage that Canada has over human rights violators in Hong Kong and China. Like Russian oligarchs, they like to store their wealth abroad because of the unstable economy in their country. And as Western countries, this is the leverage we have to hold them to account. And I believe that that in itself counterbalances the risk of them moving assets.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. A question for both witnesses on the idea of having a list naming prisoners of conscience. Would it be a good idea to have an explanation? Not just the name, but also an explanation as to why they are prisoners of conscience. Perhaps to use this as a teaching tool for the population.
Thank you. It would certainly help to, for us, that's the goal, that to share information about the prisoner of conscience. As I mentioned earlier, there are official records of over 2,000 Tibetan political prisoners, and there are details about why they were detained, what were the charges in case there were charges, and what were the prison sentences, and details about, as Jigme Gyatso testified, details about the torture that they went through, which I hope would be very helpful to the committee members. And I'm happy to submit those reports.
Madame Long?
And if I may add to I do believe it is a good idea to publish the rationale behind it. Especially in Hong Kong, there are many political prisoners who have been charged under what may seem as legitimate charges in countries with the rule of law. So, for example, we have a lot of protesters who were charged with possession of a dangerous weapon when they were only carrying, for example, an umbrella or a flashlight. These are widely known cases in Hong Kong, and there are many of them. So I think it would be good for there to be a rationale, because to the unassuming person, it might seem like they actually did something that constitutes a crime when really it is a political charge.
Merci.
Go to Ms. McPherson for 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both of the witnesses for being here today and sharing your testimony with us. I think it's so important for us to hear this, and I also sit on the International Human Rights Subcommittee, so I have heard some testimony regarding the residential schools in Tibet, and yeah, thank you for being here. I'm going to ask the same questions. I'm going to ask 2 questions, and I'll give you some time to respond if that's all right. With regards to Bill C-281, the New Democratic Party is bringing forward a number of different amendments, but one of the amendments that we'd like to see is with regards to a human rights strategy. So Canada does not have a human rights strategy that we could use as a baseline for the annual report. So what we're pushing for is that we would have that baseline so that the government could show what they've achieved, using that as the baseline. So I'd like some information on you on whether or not you would agree that a human rights strategy would be useful in this legislation. The other piece that I'd like to just ask you about very quickly, in this legislation we have a definition of a prisoner of conscience. Now, Alex Neve, the Secretary General of Amnesty International, joined us last meeting, and he suggested that instead of it be prisoner of conscience, we should have a definition that says individuals who are detained or experiencing other treatment in contravention of international human rights standards. Would you agree that that would be useful to have within this legislation, and perhaps expand on it? And perhaps I'll start with you, Mr. Thurgeon.
It would certainly be helpful to, and I agree on the amendment of human rights strategies on the Bill C-281. And although I'm not very familiar with the technicalities, but I would certainly defer to Alex Neve, who I've known for many years as a very well-respected human rights defenders, supporters to all the victims of Chinese oppression, whether it's Tibetans, Uyghurs, Hong Kongers. So in this case, I would agree with what Alex Neve has recommended.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it gives more breadth to what he brought up is the idea that there are people that have been detained, or there are people that we don't actually know whether they've been detained, but would also want to have protection under some of this legislation. Ms. Long, could you provide your thoughts?
Yes. Yes, both amendments would be agreeable to me. I don't see why there cannot be a human rights strategy from the government. We have seen a lot of different statements of concern and mandate letters, et cetera, from the government without a solid human rights strategy. So that I think would be helpful, especially for NGOs like Hong Kong Watch, who are advocating for human rights. And as for the amendment for the definition of prisoner of conscience, I believe that would be helpful. And it would definitely add more clarity to how the bill was to be applied.
And one last question for you, Ms. Long. I just want to get a little bit more information from you with regards to the use of SEMA versus the Magnitsky sanctions. Can you tell me what the difference, in your opinion, is in terms of outcome? Not in terms of the application, but in terms of outcome.
In terms of outcome, it is difficult to tell currently because we don't really have enough cases to compare them, in my opinion. We have seen a lot of sanctions under SEMA, but really not that many under the Magnitsky Act. So I think it's difficult to tell at this moment.
That's all my questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, McPherson. We now go to the second round of questioning. For this round, each member will be provided 2 minutes, with the exception of the Bloc and the NDP, which we'll get in a minute each. So we first go to Mr. Jennis. You have 2 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chair. And I think we've heard good testimony from witnesses that will inform us on potential amendments, especially around the section on how to get the balance right on the prisoners of conscience issue. In the one hand, I think there is a need to have some external pressure to on the government, and generally there's a benefit to more exposure to these cases. But there may be exceptions, and we should be cognizant of those exceptions as well. But maybe just in the limited time I had left, I did want to ask Mr. Thurchin if you could share if you think the Tibet community is impacted by foreign interference here, by CGTN or through other mechanisms. Does the repression extend to the Tibetan diaspora?
Thank you for the question. The PRC repression of Tibetans certainly extend to Tibetans outside of Tibet, to Tibetans in India, to Tibetans in Nepal, and to Tibetans in Canada, US, and elsewhere. We have seen Tibetans, one of the ways that Tibetans in exile are targeted is whether they have still families in Tibet or not. And that seemed to make a difference in preventing them in participating in any political activity. Something as simple as participating in our annual Tibetan Uprising Day, which happens to be on March 10th. And you would see that Tibetans from all walks of life, from different ages, take this day once a year very seriously to remember the massacre of thousands of Tibetans that were killed in 1959. And yet, there's a fear prevalent among many Tibetans, especially those who have families in Tibet. And so you would not see them participating in events like this. There are Tibetans, especially the human rights defenders, who have become victims, as the Freedom House reported in September last year, that Tibetans exile members of the Tibetan diaspora have faced relentless phishing and hacking attacks, as well as intimidation and threats online. On a more larger scale,
thank you, Mr. Turchin. We now go to the next member, Madame Bendayan. You have 2 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. First of all, even if Professor Terp is not there, I would like to highlight the importance of his testimony and the fact that it's also an honor to have a professor from University of Montreal in my riding to testify before the committee. If Professor Terp could provide to the committee more information with regards to other terms that might exist elsewhere in the law, either in Canada or elsewhere, and that could be used. Here, we might be looking for terms that already have a legal definition. As we have witnesses here before us today,
Take the rest of my time to ask you to elaborate a little bit in terms of your own personal experience with Tibetan prisoners. If you feel that having a list may be prejudicial, for example, for those individuals that don't make it onto the list, what message would we be sending to them?
Well, that's, I believe, a difficult choice, but it's a case that is quite common in Tibet, where the list of people who are detained do not get public. And the number that I mentioned earlier, 2,000, I would say is a very small fraction of overall numbers. And there, I would guess there are 1,000 more Tibetans who are detained, and yet we do not know of the identity of the rationale behind their arrest. So whether we should, make the list public or not, I would recommend that the list become public, so that at least we know stories. Because the problem, as I mentioned earlier, the challenge is that we do not know enough about the stories coming out of Tibet.
Is there any risk to the prisoners that would be listed? Do you have any fear or concern that they could face worse conditions as a result of being on the list?
There's certainly a risk, but as indicated in the testimony from the Jigme Gyatso, who passed away last year, they are taking this decision because they hope the people would know about it. Thank you.
Thank you. We next go to Madame Normandin. You have a minute.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. I would like to ask a similar question to both witnesses. I'll ask it to Mrs. Long. The use of a list, could it represent a prejudice to some prisoners? Could we not publish the names of those who don't want their names on a list?
Thank you for the question. I believe that it would be good for the government to consult with the families of the detained before publishing the list. We have heard from some Hong Kongers that they would rather not have their names be public, especially family members who may be living in Canada would also say the same thing, because the treatment of political prisoners in Hong Kong is very, very bad, to say it bluntly. But that should not deter the government from publishing a list in general. I believe that it would be good for the government to put pressure on the Chinese government when they are detaining political prisoners, and it would be important that we do publish that list to put pressure on them to do so.
Thank you very much. So that now means that we will move to the next panel. Before we do so...
Did I get my last minute?
Oh, my apologies, Ms. McPherson. You're absolutely right. Yes, you do get a minute. My apologies.
It's not very much time, but I certainly would still appreciate getting it. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you again to our witnesses. I think because my colleague from the bloc asked that question of our colleague online, I would ask a very similar question. Do you see a way that we could provide a list that would be both public and private based on the circumstances, so that there would be some protection for those who do not want to make their name private, and a way of saying who and how many, but without revealing identities? Would that be a solution that you could see from your perspective?
Certainly, yes. But the list we have is already public. But those those people who are detained and who do not want to be identified, sure. But our list is already public, and.
Mm-hmm. And I think when we look at legislation, it's important to recognize that this legislation will apply to the entire globe. So in some circumstances, of course, it would probably be something that those who are detained would not want public.
I agree.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And with that, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much for that. So at this point, just wanted to thank Mr. Turchin and Ms. Long for your invaluable testimony and your perspective. We will certainly make very good use of all the things that you did bring to our attention. Thank you for being here with us. We will move to the second panel now. We will just suspend for a couple of minutes, no more, and then resume. And for all those members who are online, you don't have to do anything. But we're just going to check in with the next set of witnesses. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. We will now resume our consideration of Bill C-281, as was agreed by the members. This panel we will hear from until 1:15. We have three great panelists with us here today. First, we have Mr. Earl Turcotte, who is appearing as an individual. Second, we have Mr. William Browder, who is the founder and chief executive officer and head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign. He is here on behalf of Hermitage Capital Management. And last but certainly not least, we have Ms. Farida Daif, who's here from Human Rights Watch Canada. So we're looking very much forward to your testimony. If I may, please only speak when you're recognized by the chair. We will go with Mr. Turcotte first for your opening remarks for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair and ladies and gentlemen, I'll restrict my comments to the only area of Bill C-281 with which I am competent to speak, and that is regarding cluster munitions. First, I'd like to congratulate Mr. Lawrence and parliamentary colleagues who worked with him to develop these proposed amendments. Certainly with respect to cluster munitions, what it would do is to make explicit in Canada's law what some would maintain is implicit in the prohibition on assistance in the development, use, or in any other way advancing the use of cluster munitions. I will, as you'll see very soon, be recommending that amendments go further than this provision, however. Just very quickly, for those who may not be that familiar with cluster munitions, they were first developed in World War II, used most extensively in the carpet bombing campaigns in Southeast Asia and the Vietnam War, and more recently in Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, and as I'm sure most of you know, very extensively now in Ukraine. Mostly by Russia, but there have been reports in a few instances by Ukrainian troops themselves. These are the polar opposite of a precision weapon. They have been described as conventional weapons of mass destruction. They are by design area-wide weapons. That is to say, what happens is when a cluster bomb is dropped, either ground launch or air-dropped, think of it as a large hollow casing within which there are typically hundreds of submunitions, extremely deadly submunitions, far deadlier actually than landmines on average. One cluster bomb can cover the area roughly of 3 football fields, and there are being used by Russia today multiple launch rocket systems that can launch 12 bombs or rocket rounds in succession, very quick succession, and many of them. So essentially, it's a weapon that saturates a given area and makes no distinction, of course, between combatants and non-combatants, especially when deliberately used in civilian areas, as it appears to be in the case of Ukraine. It was because of the humanitarian impact on civilians primarily, and according to the International Committee of the Red Cross and civil society experts, roughly 97% of all known victims worldwide have been civilians, and within that, 66% children, who are often drawn to the bright colors of the submunitions, and many maintain that they've been designed that way quite intentionally. It was no mistake then that the international community in the mid-2000s decided that cluster munitions had to be banned, as the world had already banned, or most of the world had already banned anti-personnel landmines, an initiative led by Canada in the late 90s, and also banned chemical and biological weapons, blinding laser weapons, among others. I had the honor, I was a public servant for 29 years, I had the honor of leading the Canadian delegation throughout the 15-month negotiations of the Convention on Cluster Munitions. Within that negotiation, the most contentious issue related to interoperability with non-party states. That is to say, our capacity, in our case as a member of NATO, to be able to continue to work effectively alongside with countries like the United States that chose not to participate in negotiations. 85% of the countries, at least, were absolutely opposed to any provision for interoperability in the convention for fear that this would provide a legal loophole that would, in some respect, contribute to the continued use of cluster munitions. I, as head of delegation, and 21 NATO colleague countries and a few non-NATO countries insisted that we had to have within the convention itself provision for interoperability, but making it very clear at the same time that this in no way would allow our troops to advance the use of cluster munitions. And in fact, we went further and said we will put right in the article itself the fact that we are legally obligated to make best efforts to discourage the use of cluster munitions by any actor under any circumstances. And that is exactly the way, in my view, and the view of 110 other state parties, that convention or that article within the convention should be interpreted. Excuse me. No sooner did we return to Canada in 2008, yes, sir, than colleagues at the Department of the Department of National Defense insisted on including in Canada's Act exceptions that would apply during combined operations with non-party states that, in my view and the view of many others, are absolutely contrary to the convention itself. That is, exceptions that would allow a Canadian commander of a multinational force to order the use of cluster munitions by non-party states, for Canada to transport them on Canadian carriers, and in many other substantive ways to aid and abet in the use of cluster munitions. So I would urge this committee to please consider amending Section 11 of Canada's Act to absolutely remove all these exceptions that are not consistent with the commitment Canada as a state party has made. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Turcotte. We now go to Mr. Browder. Mr. Browder, you have 5 minutes. We can't hear you, Mr. Browder.
Unmuted. Thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss the Magnitsky Act in Canada and ways in which we can amend and improve it. As many members of the committee know, I was one of the original advocates for the Canadian Magnitsky Act. Sergei Magnitsky was my lawyer in Russia, who was murdered for uncovering a massive corruption scheme in 2009. Canada passed the Canadian version of the Magnitsky Act in 2017. And now we're in a situation where there are 35 countries that have Magnitsky Acts and use them against human rights abusers and kleptocrats around the world. It's been a remarkable, I would say, viral legislative initiative that has done a huge amount of good, created a counterbalance to dictators and bad actors in the world, and something that gives the victims some hope for the future. And so I'm very proud to have been involved in this, but there are things that we can do to improve it, and that's what I'm here to talk about today. And the first thing I want to say is that, as many of you know, Canada rarely uses the Magnitsky Act. Canada often uses the Special Economic Measures Act when there are human rights abuses. Well, of course, it's good that sanction uses whatever it has to punish human rights abusers, but part of the beauty of the Magnitsky Act is that it is multilateral. In other words, other countries have it. And part of the benefit and part of the objective of the Magnitsky Act is that we have sanctions imposed on bad actors, not just by Canada, but by other countries as well. And so one of the problems with the Magnitsky Act in Canada is that, or I should say the Special Economic Measures Act, which is used instead of the Magnitsky Act, is that it causes confusion. And so to the extent that we want to get other countries to act in unison, which is a very important objective, that gets lost by this misnaming of something which is pretty much the same thing. And so I would argue emphatically that either the Magnitsky Act should be used, or as I understand, there's some type of proposal for an amendment to the Special Economic Measures Act to call it the Magnitsky Act, so that when you're sanctioning human rights abusers from Canada, everybody knows that you're using the Magnitsky Act, so that other people who have the Magnitsky Act are signaled to use it as well. So my first proposal for an amendment is to either rename the Special Economic Measures Act or use the Magnitsky Act when it comes to human rights abusers. Which leads me to the second proposal, which is that harmonization between countries is crucial. We now have a situation where Canada might sanction someone and the UK wouldn't. And I'm very aware of a very specific situation that I'm involved in right now, which is a friend of mine and one of the people who advocated for the Canadian Magnitsky Act, a Russian opposition dissident named Vladimir Kara-Murza, has been put in Russian prison, facing 24 years in prison for calling out Putin's war in Ukraine. Canada, very rightly and as a first country, has sanctioned a number of the people involved in his false arrest. And unfortunately, we're still now working on other countries to do the same thing. And so to the extent that there can be some type of formal provision in the Canadian Magnitsky Act to actively work with other countries to harmonize sanctions, it would have a much greater effect. And I can absolutely tell you, since I've been to all the countries, that Canada's not necessarily talking to the UK, and perhaps they're talking to the US, but there should be something formalized in the law to say that it's the responsibility to try to get other countries to do this. The third thing I would propose is that it's confusing for victims of human rights abuse to approach the government and to know how to share evidence in order to get people sanctioned. There should be a single point of contact. There should be a widespread education of how the process works among NGOs and human rights groups and victims groups, so that everybody knows how to go about doing this, so that there's no mystery. You don't need a law firm. You don't need a specialist, that anyone can go online, figure out how to present and propose evidence, and know how to do it in the best possible way. The final thing I would say is that at the moment, there is no responsibility of the government to report back to the parliament about what it's done or what it hasn't done with Magnitsky sanctions. And it's the parliament's job to oversee the government, and the government often doesn't have any good excuse for why they haven't gone forward on Magnitsky sanctions. I've been involved in a number of situations where submissions have been made, and everybody, it's like going into a black hole. After they make the submissions, nobody knows what's going to happen next. And so I believe that there should be some type of parliamentary review. There should be some type of responsibility for the government to say, here's all the submissions that we've gotten, and here's the ones we've acted on, so that there's some type of transparency and some type of accountability of the government to do this. It's a
Mr. Browder, I'm afraid you're considerably over your time limit. Okay. Perhaps we'll get back to other concerns you have during questions by the members. Thank you. So we now go to Ms. Dife from Human Rights Watch. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks. And once I hold this up, that means you really should be wrapping it up, please. Ms. Dife, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and honorable members of Parliament, for inviting me to appear before this committee. My name is Farida Deef, and I'm the Canada Director at Human Rights Watch. Human Rights Watch, as you know, is an independent international human rights organization that monitors human rights abuses in nearly 100 countries, including here in Canada. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to share thoughts on Bill C-281. In the nearly 7 years that I've been in this role, I've engaged extensively with Global Affairs Canada colleagues, both in Ottawa and at Canadian missions around the world. I've also worked on a range of policy files with relevant staff in the offices of 5 different foreign ministers appointed during this period. While I've heard more times than I can count that a certain human rights crises or the case of a prisoner detained in violation of international law was quote unquote top of mind, as civil society were often not privy to much tangible or concrete information in terms of specific actions taken by the government on their behalf. So I certainly welcome the proposed amendment to the Department of Foreign Affairs Trade and Development Act to include reporting requirements relating to international human rights. With enough concrete detail, these annual reports could be an incredibly useful tool for Canadian civil society and the human rights sector writ large. These reports could also create a yardstick to measure the implementation of GAC's own Voices at Risk guidelines on supporting human rights defenders. As noted in the guidelines, Canadian government officials should request to attend trials and visit detainees in prison, even when the detaining authority is unlikely to approve the request, in order to demonstrate that there's a continued international interest in the case. These guidelines further note attendance by Canadian officials at trials or hearings. A clear and visible expression of Canada's concern can be helpful by allowing for detailed tracking of legal proceedings, observing whether due process is respected, and ensuring up-to-date information on cases of particular interest. Seeking to visit a detainee imprisoned in violation of international human rights law can also be a meaningful way of showing support to the individual, assessing their treatment in detention, and registering condemnation with the detaining authority. This is why the current amendment on human rights reporting should include detailed information, not only on those prisoners who the government is actively advocating for their release, but also any efforts to attend trials and hearings, the number of requests for prison visits made by Canadian missions and authorities, and the response of the detaining authorities. Of course, in some cases, it would be important to anonymize the names of prisoners to mitigate security risks and possible retaliation. I'd like to turn now to the bill's proposed amendments to the Cluster Munitions Act. Human Rights Watch has played a leading role in documenting the harm to civilians caused by cluster munitions, including most recently in the Ukraine conflict, and our research and analysis has informed the negotiation and implementation of the Convention on Cluster Munitions. In 2012, my colleagues in the Arms Division testified before the Senate Foreign Affairs International Trade Committee on then Bill S-10, the Prohibiting Cluster Munitions Act. We also submitted written testimony to the House of Commons Standing Committee, highlighting several key provisions that would benefit from revision or clarification, including the need to explicitly prohibit investment in cluster munitions. As you know, the preamble of the Convention on Cluster Munitions articulates its goal to eliminate cluster munitions and to bring an end to the suffering that they cause. The current bill would advance that objective by reducing funding for the production of cluster munitions. It could also help Canada meet its obligations under Article 9 to take all appropriate legal, administrative, and other measures to implement the convention. Article 1(1)(c) of the convention makes it unlawful for state parties to assist anyone with any activity prohibited by the convention, and investment in cluster munition production is a form of assistance. The funding of entities that develop and produce cluster munitions and their components allows them and encourages them to keep doing so. The amendment proposed in Bill C-281 thus moves Canada one step closer to ensuring that it implements the convention in accordance with the letter and spirit of the law. In the process, it also provides much needed clarity to financial and other institutions relating to the prohibition on assistance with production of cluster munitions. The amendment is also in line with measures taken by Canada's allies. Since 2007, 11 state parties to the convention have enacted legislation that explicitly prohibits investment in these weapons. Nearly 40 states have stated that they regard investment in cluster munition production as a form of assistance that is prohibited by the convention. It's also important to note that like-minded governments have worked to close any remaining indirect investment loopholes. For example, government pension funds in Australia, France, Ireland, Luxembourg, New Zealand, Norway, and Sweden have either fully or partially withdrawn investments or banned investments in cluster munition producers. We strongly support these efforts to explicitly prohibit investment in the production of cluster munitions. We also support any efforts, as mentioned by others, to close remaining loopholes in the existing law that will undercut Canada's ability to fulfill the humanitarian potential of the Convention on Cluster Munitions. Thank you for your attention to these urgent matters and your efforts to advance Canada's leadership on these critical fronts.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dife. We now go to the members for their questions. For the first round, you will each get 3 minutes. But for the responses, if I do put this up, please wrap up your remarks within 15 seconds. So we first go to Mr. Chong. You have 3 minutes, sir.
Last weekend, the New York Times had a headline for an article that said, quote, Canada is such an attractive place for money laundering that there's even a special name to describe the activity there, snow washing, end quote. One way sanctions are evaded is through the laundering of money, whether it's money for the proceeds of terrorism or money from the proceeds of corruption. So my question is for Ms. Dief and Mr. Browder. Mr. Browder, you wrote a piece recently with Brandon Silver and Erwin Kotler that listed a number of recommendations, one of which was that Canada's targeted sanctions must be more effectively enforced. And you referenced glaring loopholes in Canada's sanctions enforcement. Could you elaborate on what those glaring loopholes are?
Should I go first?
Yes, please. And time is brief, so if you could provide a brief answer, and we could also hear from Ms. Dief.
Yep. Canada, from my perspective, basically doesn't have a infrastructure in which to prosecute high-level financial crimes. We've seen it with our own eyes in relation to the Magnitsky case. We brought evidence to the Royal RCMP about dirty money from the Magnitsky murder coming to Canada. That information was not acted on properly in spite of law enforcement agencies in many other countries with the same evidence acting on it decisively. And so I think that there is a serious lack of capability within the law enforcement agencies. And as far as I'm aware, the amount of money frozen in Canada from these current Russian sanctions is quite small, and a lot smaller than the amount of money that is in Canada. And so I think that Canada needs to step up to the plate, needs to get a lot more aggressive in terms of both law enforcement and government actions in terms of sanctioning individuals. Thank you.
Ms. Dief?
Thank you. So I mean, we don't actively research money laundering issues in Canada, but certainly share many of the concerns that were raised by Mr. Browder earlier around the lack of transparency and accountability in the current system in place, sanction system in place in Canada, and the challenges that we face as civil society and others in formulating submissions to relevant officials in order to propose individuals to sanction. There isn't really a clear system to do that, and so that remains an outstanding challenge that we hope to rectify.
Thank you. We now go to MP McKay. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and I want to commend Mr. Lawrence for putting this bill forward. Regrettably, there's 4 subject matters here that are would deserve to be a bill by themselves, and it's very difficult to kind of focus. I'm going to focus on the section with respect to foreign officials, and of course, it's delightful to see Mr. Browder again, and I appreciate his relentless efforts. I think, however, it would be remiss if I didn't give Mr. Browder a minute to tell us, to give us an update on the health and status of Mr. Vladimir Kara-Murza.
Thank you, Mr. McKay. This is really an important issue. Vladimir Kara-Murza, as I mentioned, is facing 24 years in prison for standing up to the Putin regime. And as many of you will know, he was poisoned twice in 2015 and 2017 by the Russian government, nearly died in both cases. He's now in prison. The effects of the poison have plagued him throughout his time. And he has lost the feeling of his feet from the nerve damage that the poison has done. His situation is so extreme that they actually suspended the politically motivated show trial that they put him on, which is very unusual, which shows how concerned the Russians are not to have him basically perish in the middle of the trial. And so this has reached a level of what I would say is extremely urgent situation. The Parliament, I understand that there is a motion in the Parliament to make him an honorary Canadian citizen so that the Canadian government can advocate more effectively on his behalf. And I hope that you and others will support that, because this is such he's a friend of Canada. He's a friend of this Parliament. He's a person who is very effective in doing all the things that we're talking about today and making it all happen, and he deserves our support.
I couldn't agree with you more. I just it puts a flesh and blood on what we are actually talking about, and we all hope that Vladimir is able to rejoin us. But thank you, sir, for your relentless advocacy. I have a dozen questions, and I have no time. And I just want to say that it does puzzle me why the government prefers to use the CIMA provisions as opposed to Magnitsky sanctions. So I phoned a contact this morning and asked him why, because he's the one that writes the packages, and he didn't know. So I think that if this committee does anything, it would be useful to sort out why Magnitsky sanctions are not preferred over CIMA sanctions, since the preparation of the package, the presentation to the lawyers, the presentation to the minister, the presentation to the cabinet, and the presentation to and the ultimate order in council are all the same. So I don't know whether you have any insight into that, Mr. Browder, but it does puzzle me.
Well, I think that this is do I have time to answer this?
15 seconds, please.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think this is a historic view that was taken by previous governments that didn't want to offend Putin. Putin is very offended by the word Magnitsky. In the past, different foreign ministers didn't want to offend Putin when we were in this world of appeasement. We're not in a world of appeasement anymore. Nobody wants to appease Putin. We should always call it Magnitsky, both because it's the right thing to do. It's the word that it's now a verb pretty much around the world. And it also has the added benefit of upsetting Putin every time he hears the word.
We now move to Ms. Normandin. You have 3 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thank you to all witnesses. My questions are for Mrs. Dave and Mr. Turcotte on cluster munitions. We've spoken about monetary issues. There might be a risk that we might criminalize investors who are not aware of the fact that their investments, oftentimes indirect investments, are used for companies that create cluster munitions, it was said that we might have to have a section of knowledge of this, as such as what New Zealand did. Would this be a way to avoid penalizing people who are not aware, or on the contrary, would this already be covered by the Act, or would it another possibility to have an add-on in order to avoid the Act, to say, oh, well, I don't know, and then it's a kind of a loophole.
Able to watch a videotape of previous discussions that this committee has had on that very issue, and I have to say I agree completely that intent is germane to the actions that are taken indirectly. And in my view, I am sure our former colleagues at the Department of Justice can provide language in any amendment that would make it very clear that if Canadians, through no fault of their own, no willful negligence in this case, indirectly invest in cluster munitions, that they will not be held accountable, while at the same time holding those institutions and individuals accountable who are very much aware of their actions.
Madame Dave.
Mrs. Dave.
Thank you very much for the question. I mean, our position has always been the same from the time that we testified around the cluster munitions bill to today, when it was being drafted, 9 years ago now. Our belief is that Canada should ensure that there is a clear prohibition, a categoric prohibition on assistance, foreign stockpiling, transit, and investment of cluster munitions. How that becomes operationalized, how to ensure that individuals who are potentially kind of inadvertently investing, how those types of issues should be mitigated, that I leave up to members of this committee. But certainly that's our position is very clear in terms of ensuring that Canada removes any obstacles that are in the way of achieving the convention, the Cluster Munition Convention's goals, or are running counter to the goals of the convention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Deef. We now move to
Ms. Matheson.
Ms. Matheson. You have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I want to thank you, Mr. Turcotte, and I'll put my first question to you. The NDP absolutely agrees in terms of that elimination of Section 11, and we will be putting forward an amendment at this committee to do so for that elimination. Could you talk, though, you were very, very clear about this, but could you talk about the consequences of if that elimination of Section 11 wasn't accomplished?
Well, yes, thank you very much for that question. The main consequence would be that Canada would finally be compliant with the convention itself and its obligations. The second result would be that we would be consistent with the position that has been taken by 110 other state parties to the convention. So it would be extremely positive. Now, in terms of effectiveness in combined operations with non-party states, I firmly believe that at the time, this is 15 years ago, that colleagues from the Department of National Defence believed that not having these exceptions would somehow compromise Canada's effectiveness. We have 15 years of hindsight, and we have seen what legislation has been passed by our NATO allies and others who are like-minded. And the fact that not one of them has included in their legislation such provisions, and certainly other countries such as the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and others have the same level of concern about interoperability as we do, and it has not compromised their effectiveness, nor do I think in any real sense has it compromised Canada. So just to say, I don't believe that those exceptions have in any way enabled Canada to play a more effective role in combined operations than if they had not been there. Thank you.
Ms. Deef, could you elaborate if you have anything to elaborate actually on that same question?
I mean, certainly we would agree that that amendment to Section 11 is necessary. This is something that we've been calling on Canada to do since the very beginning. And, those are they remain key concerns for us. Issues around investment. I mean, I think we're pleased that one loophole, which is the issue around investment in cluster munitions, is going to be addressed by the current amendment to Bill C-281. But at the same time, there are other loopholes, which include Section 11, that should be addressed.
Mr. Turcotte, sorry?
Is remaining, so if we could have a
quick
response.
Okay. That goes fast. So in previous testimony, government witnesses talked about the fact that Canada would never condone the use of those cluster munitions, and yet they don't push for that elimination in Section 11. Why do you think that is? Could you comment on that?
Well, yes, we actually are trying to have it both ways. On one hand, we say we claim that our country is a state party in good standing, fully compliant with the convention, and yet we continue to have in the Act a list of exceptions. As I say, it goes beyond aiding and abetting, and there is a section of that wider section that actually enables the Canadian commander of a multinational force to authorize or direct the use of cluster munitions by non-party state forces, not by Canadians, by others. In this case, we are the author of the order, and non-party states become our agents. And that is in no way consistent with what we negotiated in a 15-month period 15 years ago now.
Thank you, Mr. Turcotte. We now go to Mr. Jennis. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Deef, well, the conclusion I'm drawing from some of the back and forth about the section on prisoners of conscience is that it's not good enough for the government to just say, just trust us. There should be some mechanisms of pressure and accountability around the listing of those individuals, accountability to parliamentarians, to civil society, and to the wider public. But at the same time, there does need to be some margin for flexibility. There may be legitimate cases where, based on the wishes of the person involved, their family, their advocates, and their own assessment of their interests, publication of their name doesn't make sense. So I think what we have to do in the amending process is come up with some procedure that does involve pressure on the government, that does involve publication of names, in many cases bringing more sunlight to this, more accountability, but also some measure of flexibility. Would you agree with that assessment, and do you think it would be useful to publish some names while having others anonymized based on the wishes of the families or a sincere calculation of the interests of the people involved?
Yes, I mean, I agree that I think a hybrid type of solution makes the most sense, to include some names where family members have agreed to it. Those individuals are perhaps very public already in the public sphere, while including the number of others that are being advocated for. So, for example, it would be interesting to say in China, the Minister of Foreign Affairs is actively advocating for the release of these 3 said individuals, as well as 6 other detainees who will remain anonymous. But having that type of information and content is really important for us. We have none of that at the moment. We have the voices at risk guidelines, but we have no real sense of when Canadian missions and officials overseas are actually meeting with prisoners, are requesting to monitor trials. None of that data currently exists, and so that's the type of information that we need.
Thank you, Ms. Deef. So we now go to MP Sorbera. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for your testimony. I'd like to go to Mr. Browder. Mr. Browder, I've personally followed much of what you've done over the years, and I want to thank you for that. I'm not a permanent member of this committee, and I do feel it's quite a privilege to ask you a question. In your opening comments, you talked about why harmonization is so important between countries. Can you elaborate on that aspect of everything you've worked on and why it's so important that countries cooperate and collaborate on this initiative? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good to meet you here. So it's I'll just use a real life example in the Magnitsky case. So Sergei Magnitsky was murdered for uncovering a $230 million corruption scheme. The people who stole that money and killed him keep that money in the West, and we wanted to shut down the West for them so they couldn't use their bank accounts and they couldn't travel. And we succeeded in the United States, in Canada, in the UK, and Australia. But for some reason, because of the European Union's unanimity requirement, Hungary objected, and so nobody was sanctioned in the European Union. So although the sanctions have been quite effective and punishing on the individuals, they could still freely travel in and out of the European Union, and that upsets me, and it upsets Sergei's family, and it's not right. And there's many other similar situations where in all of these sanctions regimes where they're sanctioned by one country or two countries or three countries, but not by all the countries. And so to be effective, you have to basically close off the world to human rights abusers and kleptocrats. And to close off the world, everybody has to do it. And so this is probably one of the most important parts of the Magnitsky regime, is to create a situation where we do close off the world. And so I do hope that this becomes a priority and a target, and something which Canada takes seriously. And of course, I'm working and saying the same thing to other governments. And so when I come here and I talk to you, I'm also saying the same thing to the British, to the United States, to the European Union. And it's hard to get everybody to work together, but I think this is something that's of very, very, very high importance.
To Madame Normandin, you have 1 minute remaining.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. My question is for Mr. Browder. You spoke of the importance for countries to harmonize together for the Magnitsky, but with this act, the committee could publicly talk about the application of a sanction and make a recommendation to the Department of Foreign Affairs. Do you think that this could stop harmonization with other countries, or do you think it could happen at the same time? That is to say that government could work on harmonization and the committee could work on the selection of individuals for application of this.
Well, so I think that it's very important for both things to happen. I think the Parliament is very, very important, and this committee is very, very important in keeping holding the government's feet to the fire. And once the government's feet have been held to the fire, when the government has made a conscious, proactive decision to do something, then it's very much incumbent on them to call up the counterparts in the United States and the UK and the European Union and say that we have evidence. This evidence has been presented by our parliament or by human rights activists, and we're going to sanction these people, and we'd like you to do it as well. And I think that in having both things happen, it's only good. There's no downside, and really is there should be nobody to argue against this idea. And I'm sure other than people who just don't want to do more work in the Global Affairs Canada by calling up their counterparts, I think this has to be formalized.
Thank you. For the final question, we go to Ms. Matheson. You get a minute. Take it away, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Deef, I'd like to ask you, so the NDP will introduce an amendment requiring the government to develop an international human rights strategy, which would then allow for an annual report to be addressed by it. Do you agree that such a strategy is necessary, and could you tell us a bit why you would agree with that?
Yeah, no, I mean, a strategy is critical. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we've had 5 different foreign ministers in the past 7 years that I've been in this role. That's significant transition. Having, an overarching strategy, a multi-year strategy would mean that there would be some continuity on key human rights files. We wouldn't be reinventing the wheel with every transition. So certainly critical to have a human rights strategy for that reason. And also in order to create a sort of yardstick, a benchmark to assess the, ministers' actions and activities with respect to human rights. So that I think will be very critical. And just to, if I can make a final point, if I have the time, in terms of, I know there's been a conversation around prisoners of conscience and kind of the framing of the language around the human rights reporting. I agree with Alex Neve in terms of the language being, prisoners who are detained in violation of international law. I think that's a much broader definition that would also, capture the two Michaels who were detained in China, for example, Canadian, Iranian dual nationals, and others who are detained on trumped up, espionage, terrorism, treason charges, who are not necessarily prisoners of conscience. They may just be ordinary engineers, doctors, et cetera, who are dual nationals and are then detained. And so a kind of larger, over-encompassing definition, I think, would be much more effective.
Thank you, and that concludes this session. Allow me to thank Mr. Turcotte, who is here in person, as well as Mr. Browder and Ms. Deef. We're very, very grateful for your time and your testimony, and our apologies that this particular session was truncated just because we had some votes in the House. So on that note, let me thank you again, and looking forward to perhaps having you back at committee very soon. Thank you. And for the members, just wanted to say Tuesday, April 18th, when we get back, the first session, we are having clause-by-clause consideration of Bill C-281, and was wondering whether it's the will of the committee to adjourn.